So thank you all for joining us today. This is a series of fireside chats we're putting together for Haku Global, and we're interested in helping making leadership more futures intelligent. And we're having our advisors kind of share some of their background experience and expertise with a wider audience. And so today we have John Sweeney joining us. And a little bit about John. He's an award-winning author, designer, and futurist. As a practitioner and consultant and educator, John has organized, managed, and facilitated workshops and seminars, multi-stakeholder projects, and foresight gaming systems in over 45 countries in 5 continents, with participants all around the world. And at present, John is a visiting professor and senior research fellow at Westminster International University in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. He's currently served as the co-editor-in-chief of World Futures Review, a journal of strategic foresight. And John is a member of World Future Studies Federation and the Association of Professional Futurists. His work has been published in Futures, the Journal of Future Studies, World Futures Review, and other academic and media outlets. And if you want to follow him on Twitter and learn about trends and emerging issues or things he's interested in, you can follow him at aloha_futures. And so I'm going to turn this over to John. He's going to talk about play and how that relates to foresight, leadership, futures in post-normal times.
Great. Thanks so much, Tyler. It's really nice to be able to connect with everyone. I look forward to lots of time for conversation, and also really nice to see so many friends and colleagues join as well. So I'm going to share my screen quickly because I did put some slides together. And I'm going to do the opposite of what you're supposed to do. So you're supposed to have a nice title slide that's explaining what you're going to do, and then you're going to just do it step by step. I'm going to actually try to deconstruct every aspect of the title of the presentation. So my aim is actually to end with probably more questions than answers. And I do want to at the outset say that's intentional. Sometimes with presentations, you always have the opportunity for the Scooby-Doo ending. But hopefully, again, we end up in a place where there are lots of questions, and I look forward to a really rich conversation. First, I want to say what, again, a pleasure and honor it is to connect and to support Haku, and of course to work with Tyler. Tyler's been a friend and colleague since way back in the Hawaii days, and we've always stayed in touch over the years, and have so much respect for his work and for the spaces that he creates. So really appreciate the opportunity. I think when we had talked about what I could do, and of course there are a number of really great advisors, many also involved in futures and foresight work, I really wanted a chance to talk about play. I've used a lot of games and simulations in my work over the last 10 years. So I've done games for the government of Singapore, government of Dubai, Fortune 500 companies, large international organizations, and I'll talk about some of that work as the presentation goes on. But I think actually that there's a really important aspect that certainly we're figuring out now in 2020. How can we use play to learn? And actually, you know, I say that we're figuring this out. The truth is, this has been happening for a really long time. So the video that's playing in the background is from a documentary that was put together from 1967. I believe it was put together and shown on CBS News, called The Futurists. And it shows the Rand Corporation, and there's Olaf Helmer, one of the famous sort of, you know, old guard folks and figures of the foresight and futures field. And of course, they're doing this serious game, which at the time was actually, you know, quite a vanguard thing to do for think tanks. And they were looking at different trends and emerging issues, some of which are very still relevant today when you look at the technology and the impacts of other things. And so what I wanted to actually bring up was there is a long history of using play to learn. And that's something that is done quite a lot. And it has a really long history. So again, I think what's important for me is when we talk about playing to learn, it's who's playing and who's learning. And if you look around here, you can see that's a fairly homogenous group. So you've got lots of, you know, Euro-American males, you do have the occasional woman kind of spotted in. And of course, you're talking fundamentally about people that either have access to education or are already participating in education systems. So I think one of the big things to question around this idea of playing to learn is, okay, who has the opportunity to play? Some see play, of course, as a privilege. And I think it very much is. And we relate that privilege, of course, to what we see within educational systems. So I want to talk about another approach, one that I was directly involved in, that I think is specifically calling into question these kinds of assumptions around play and what play can look like. So I spent a year working with the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, the largest humanitarian organization in the world. It does a strategy every 10 years. And how do you talk to somewhere between 11 and 14 million people to get their perspective, especially on the future? Obviously, that's a huge, gargantuan task. So we actually, through a partner, were able to develop this game called What Futures. And What Futures is a game played entirely on WhatsApp. There were two versions of the game. The second version of the game had about 4,000 players from 120 countries, generated all kinds of data. And again, this was a way of not just democratizing play, but actually playing in a way that allowed people to engage with their everyday life. So it was a mix of kind of blending play from the future into the present, but also directly meeting people where they were at. So using a simple medium like WhatsApp. And I say simple, there were lots of technical challenges in delivering and designing an entire gaming experience using WhatsApp. And part of this was because, as I mentioned, the partner, it was the Open Lab, which is a human-computer interaction lab based at Newcastle University. So we've written a bit about this, but what I think is important here, it was getting outside of play in that sense of the think tank or play within the context of the expert, right? Really trying to change the nature of play. Now, when we talk about playing to learn and the learning that creates, I also think that we're still in the position of learning to play, which is we are still actually finding out so much about what play does, how play works, and how play is really a contextual means to think about education as a process. So again, I'll share the presentation with you, and I won't be reading line by line. I realize it's quite small to see. This is a poster presentation from colleagues at Columbia University who received a grant from the National Science Foundation in the US to develop games around communicating science, and specifically a lot of games based on climate change. One game, they did a study, which has a different kind of impact, or what's the impact of a game for students versus reading a journal article for class. It turns out that retention of material, in other words, actually learning and then memorizing and keeping the material, was better through gameplay. But, and there's a caveat there, that when it comes to systems thinking, like making connections between things, the students actually showed better results by reading the article. So we're still, again, learning how to play. We're learning how play works. There's lots of fantastic evidence, but it always has to relate to context. And so I think what I really like about this study is it raises really important questions, but they also designed the entire process of play to be studied as well. Another project that I was directly involved in that I think shows how play works when it's a process, not just a product, is the scenario exploration system. It was recently included in OECD's reports around global trends for 2020, around how governments are embracing innovation. Colleagues and I at the European Commission created this game about 5 years ago. It's had about a dozen different versions. We've written a number of articles about it. And to me, the most important part is not the fact that, again, this happened within the European Commission, typically a very conservative organization. They do have a policy lab, and this was the first project of that policy lab, but the fact that it's kept going. So in other words, it's more like what is called an infinite game. The idea is to keep playing over and over and over. So the real product here is the process. And so I think that's where lots of organizations are still learning how play can be used and thinking about play differently. Now, I also promised in the title I'd be talking about games, futures, and leadership. So I'm going to just quickly shift a little bit to that. Now, all of this is framed within the context of post-normal times. I began working on this theory and this approach in 2014 when I met Zia Sardar, who really started this line of thought in around 2010 with an article that he had written. And in 2014, it was a hard sell. In 2014, you go around talking about post-normal times, people were like, yeah. 2020, it's a different story. You say post-normal times, they say, oh yeah, okay, we get it. And I think fundamentally that's because we're realizing that we are living in a unique moment where, of course, we have issues with inequality. Of course, we have issues with, climate. The challenges and the issues themselves are things that we've seen enduring for, let's say, years, decades, sometimes even longer. But fundamentally, we're seeing these issues really clash. We're seeing these issues really come to a head. People are clearly taking to the streets. People are clearly frustrated. We're exhausted, right? Whether when we look at social inequality in the US, or we actually think about the challenges of the climate emergency, and nothing encapsulates that more than what we're seeing happen with the kind of swirling kinds of post-normal moves I think, in the US in related to politics. And clearly we're in the lead up to a very contentious election. And there are big questions about what does normal start to look like. And I think one of the things I want to throw out there is that to actually think about leading and to think about really challenging our assumptions about the future during this time, we have to hold normal in kind of an in-between space, which is to say that we can't rush to say what the new normal is going to be. We certainly don't, I think we all feel, want to go back to the old normal. So keeping it in that post-normal space is an intentional way to really kind of challenge the assumptions that we have. Now, as this relates to play and games, really fascinating study was done about 2 decades of pandemic war games. We know there have been some amazing simulations that were run that actually talked about a coronavirus pandemic, actually went into a bit of the details. I mean, really anticipated. I'm going to say forecasted. I'm not going to say predicted. That's sort of one of the taboo words of being a foresight practitioner. But what they failed to account for was Donald Trump. And again, I think that really exemplifies the post-normal age that we're in, calling into question the assumptions we have. In other words, we can't just do simple models and games and simulations. We really have to challenge our thinking and bring that post-normal times perspective into even the games themselves if we want to develop, I think, the leadership skills and capacities. And so there are 2 aspects that I really want to hit on here. Of course, foresight is well known for engaging with uncertainty. How do we navigate uncertainty? How do we bring uncertainty in decision-making? How do we engage with complexity in more dynamic ways such that uncertainty is not seen as something we have to bracket off, but something that actually is critical to decision-making processes? The flip side of uncertainty is ignorance. So uncertainty for me is, okay, do we think that we understand something? Are we sure about, let's say, the provenance of information or data? Ignorance is either we don't know, or we believe that there's misinformation, disinformation at play. And again, these 2, I think, are driving forces that really help us to give more texture and depth to the way that we can structure learning experiences, games, and simulations in post-normal times. Clearly, right now, we're all feeling the brunt of this. But I think fundamentally, if we lapse back into, let's say, a post-virus, context, whatever that looks like, and that's obviously going to look different in different places, I think it's important that we try to suspend this post-normal moment precisely so we have more time to try to design and shape a better future. And I think the opportunity is there. And of course, people talk about taking advantage of a crisis. And I think this moment exactly does offer that, but it requires, I think, a bit more thinking and a bit more engagement. Now, as this relates to leadership, I think also we're seeing clearly a variety of forms of leadership. We're seeing amazing messaging, some fantastic work done from Taiwan, New Zealand, lots of other places, really being transparent, open, communicating. And of course, we're seeing the opposite in lots of other places. And again, as an American, I feel the brunt of that. And I wanted to talk about 2 sort of framings. One is from Isabel Stengers. I think now more than ever, when we talk about the opportunity for play, and to use play as a means to learn, that play is really about hope. I mean, we play games precisely because we don't know the outcome. If we were going to play a game and we knew we were going to lose every time, why would we play the game? So play fundamentally is about the hope, right? The possibility, the potentiality of the victory. And I think what's important there and how this relates to futures and foresight is that hope, and I love this phrase, really is that in-between space between probability and possibility. And I think Isabel Stengers was riffing off of the famous cybernetic thinker, Lewis Mumford, and I think this is also how I feel. I'm a pessimist about probabilities. When we look at the data around climate change, when we look at the long history of social inequality in places like the U.S., and you look at the probabilities, you look at the numbers, wow, it's hard not to think, wow, this is going to be bad and get worse. But I'm an optimist about possibilities, which is to say things can always be otherwise. We always have the opportunity for things to be different. We just obviously need to do a better job at marshaling the political will, creating systems, institutions that are able to take that on. And I think fundamentally, it's getting institutions and organizations to learn, and play is a great means to do that. So I just wanted to throw that out as some provocations. Would love to continue the conversation. Thanks for listening. Mahalo nui. Spasibo balshoe, because I'm in Belarus. And yeah, look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks, John. I want to open this up to questions, and that'll, help us to go dive deeper into this topic that John's hitting on here. So, does anybody have any questions they want to ask for John?
First one's always the hardest.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, John. Like with your work just I guess from a procedural side, is like, how do you see organizations, leaders, politicians embracing the idea of using play as a tool?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's certainly been all over the map. So, I've got this sort of pocket full of anecdotes from trying to go around and to do two things that actually seem completely outside of the normal for lots of organizations. So one is to actually get them to think critically and creatively about the future. And the second is get them to play. So for example, the first time I was ever in Macedonia, which is now Northern Macedonia, I was working with United Nations Development Program. And I walked into the office of the coordinator for UNDP, who was actually the coordinator for the whole UN system in that country. And this is no joke, her first words to me were, okay, so we're paying you to play and we're paying you to talk about the future. And I was like, oh, wow, this is as far as a cold open, that was pretty intense, right? And by the end of that conversation, she'd come around when I had, again, shifted some of my language. So game was a problematic term for her. She associated game with Candyland and her kids and everything else. And I said, look, really what we're doing is we're using play as a means to facilitate what I ended up calling at the time an enhanced survey tool. And that's exactly what we were doing. We were getting information from people. We were literally going through the same process. And we had this game that was built. We went around 10 different municipalities. The game then lived on in other versions. We brought it to schools. So the whole idea was we were getting data from people. People were localizing and prioritizing information. They were telling us things. They were spotting information, sometimes on maps. So we were able to do the things that a survey does. We were just able to make it fun. And I think that fundamentally is one of the key metrics. The UN is a great example. It has a really great gathering power to bring people together. But it fundamentally, people go to these meetings over and over again, and they don't feel like there's that level of engagement. So in your point around how do leaders and decision makers take this on, what I think play does is it acts as a leverage point. If you have more participation, if you have more engagement, if you have more people as part of the process, I think that necessitates leaders, again, in many contexts, of course, it's different in a variety of contexts, and having them feel more that it's a validated process. They feel inclined to then listen to that if there's that further engagement. And I think now more than ever, they're realizing, the surveys and these other approaches, like we can do better. We can find ways of activating people's, sense of, hope, their sense of engagement. So I have seen and been at events where there's been high level engagement. So Prime Minister of Dubai came to a gaming session that we had there with the Ministry of Energy on their next national energy strategy. Again, it varies in lots of contexts, but I think in governments and policy contexts, and certainly even in corporate contexts, where the leadership sees the opportunity to really have learning be dynamic, I think there's a lot of openness to play.
Darwin?
And I'll probably pipe in because I'm a Lego Serious Play certified facilitator. And that's where, when you dangle Lego and you have leadership in there, across all level. In fact, I think serious play definitely because of the juxtaposition of serious and then play. Because the minute you just say play, the connotation is that it's without purpose and it's frivolous. That's why I keep using the word serious play. And then when we get to the point of thinking about the tool, especially when exploring a specific problem, like or an application, I've applied Lego Serious Play right now in service design, even to the point of most specific of the service design component, which is customer journey mapping. And then you bring it to, I was in Philippines, I was in the leadership of a global financial firm, and they had about 40 leadership executive there, and then we were playing. And I think the notion of play alone without serious play might be a stumbling block. But the minute that leadership gets into it, it's just quite easy dealing with them and then just addressing the challenges that they have. So just from the trenches, sharing with you guys in terms of there is a space for play in corporate.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think there has been, like we said, with Lego And obviously now the explosion of serious games, to that bolt-on of serious is really important. Just like when I said enhanced survey tool, if you can get in the door, then the experience and the process really allows that serendipity, that magic to happen. But sometimes you need that to get in the door, right? So serious game, serious play. Sometimes I would call what I do a simulation, or sometimes that. Again, whatever you have to do to kind of get in, and then you can allow the process to kind of unfold. Yeah, that's great. That's great experience.
For serious,
I think Basir.
Foresight practitioners. It was a great presentation. Now, foresight practitioners have a hard time explaining what they do. Now, given it's been studied by Rand Corporation for several decades, and these days, I mean, up until reaching the post-normal times, tarot card readers and astrologers get a whole lot more respect than foresight practitioners. Now, I was fortunate enough to have worked with insurance executives also myself, basically helping them develop their instincts, intuition, and thereby foresight. Now, what should be the strategy for foresight practitioners and also futurists in explaining what it is that they do to the general public? I know it's a bit odd question. I don't know.
No, that's a fantastic question. I mean, it's a question that I get all the time, right? I mean, let me frame this question by saying, my father was an accountant for 40 years, and he is mystified by the fact that you can make a living by talking to people about the future, right? I mean, so I've had to explain it at that level. And of course, different clients who hear about it, they're not sure what it is. I love this quote by the French theorist Michel Foucault, and I use it all the time. So he talks about his work, and he did a lot of work kind of looking at history, trying to write, different perspectives. And the first thing he says is, look, I'm no prophet. So I say the same, I don't predict the future. In fact, if you ask me what, X year is going to be or what's going to happen, I'm going to say that to me is not necessarily interesting. What's interesting is, can I understand enough about what's possible that I can make better decisions and take action today? So that's the first part. The second part, Michel Foucault says, is my job is to make windows where there are walls. And I love that. I love that framing, because actually what I try to do is, again, help organizations, help communities, even of course at the individual level with some of the coaching and mentoring work that I do, again, see things from different perspectives. So when you put a window into a wall, you let in light, right? Of course, it gives you a better and different view to things outside, but it allows you to have a different sense of things internally. So there's that kind of internal and external dynamic. Now, as you know, you can't just put a window into any wall. If the wall is load bearing, the whole thing could fall down, right? So you have to know what that looks like. And that's why we talk about it as a practice. I often say that all of this is more about recipe than it is about formulas, right? It's about finding the right ways of taking the ingredients within an organization, within a particular project, and putting it together in a form that works for them. So I think, again, this question is great. I mean, look, I've heard the crystal ball joke in every country I've ever been to. So I think it is something that we continuously confront. But, kind of the mantra often is, and that's why futures, of course, is plural. We try to explore different futures. We try to bring that multiplicity, that possibility conversation, and then of course bring that back to the organization through learning or decision making, or leadership capacity development. And again, it varies, but I always try to keep it in that space. That's something that I've really come back to over the past few years, especially.
Thank you very much.
I have another question, John, for you. Where do you see, after you go through a gaming session or series and you get the results, what typically do you find organizations or leaders doing with those results, and where do they kind of end up in the value chain and their decision making?
Yeah, it's been all over the map. So I mentioned the Dubai example really briefly. So I was brought in with some colleagues to work with the Ministry of Energy and the Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Government Innovation, which is a PMO, Prime Minister's Office level innovation agency. So really high up in government. And again, we had this project to focus on next national energy strategy. And Ministry of Energy said, actually, we're done. We've got our scenarios. We've got our preferred future. We've talked to our experts. This is what we want. And the innovation team said, no, you have to connect with people. You have to let's challenge our perspectives. Let's open it up. So we said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Another firm was brought in to have an experiential futures engagement. So they created artifacts from these different futures. And then we built a game that allowed a group of people to actually play through those scenarios. Rather than having just words on a page and just kind of, out there, they were actually able to do that. And what we did was we ran that session and then we had a break. We quickly tabulated the results and we said, this is the outcome from the gaming session. Now, it just so happened that the group that we had playing, and we had a mixed group, we had academics, we had youth, we had government, we had public, civil service, we had private sector. They actually ended up validating the preferred scenario of the Ministry of Energy. So immediately at that actual event, it was closed door. Actually, we all of us, a number of us left the room. The prime minister was there. It was a 30-minute meeting. They went for it. And the next day, I picked up the newspaper, and it was next national energy strategy adopted by the UAE. Now, that doesn't always happen, right? It's not always the case that there's immediate results and immediate outcome. But that was one instance where that actually happened. In other instances, sometimes the game results, the game outcomes force you to go back to the drawing board. It forces you to ask a new kind of question. So I've actually gone pretty far in projects. I won't name names, but you get to it, you get to a gaming outcome and you realize, wait a second, actually the data that we're getting is forcing us to rethink what it is we're doing. So shifting a priority, shifting a goal, opening up a new program opportunity. I think with the European Commission, the scenario exploration system example, what it has done quite interestingly, it has actually allowed the organization, and again, this is it's the European Commission, pretty again, not a bad word by any stretch, but certainly has negative connotations, a bureaucratic organization, right? That is, very, in many ways, conservative, but they've really been dynamic, and now they have multiple games, again, multiple versions of this game, and what they've actually been able to kind of break down are some of the borders and barriers that people might have about approaching the European Commission. The game has sort of evolved a life of its own, so different people have taken it on and used it. So actually what we're trying to do now is trying to track the outcomes from the game. What impact has this had? It's being used in business schools, it's being used by nonprofits, it's sort of all over the place now. And so actually one of the outcomes there, interestingly, is not just the game results, but the game itself and the community that's developed around it. So again, sometimes you have this really immediate impact, boom, strategy, policy, plans, shift that. Sometimes, let's ask a new question. We need a new plan, we need a new policy. We have to go back to the drawing board. And sometimes this kind of emergent community can come out of things. And so those are some of the options or some of the effects I've seen from different games and gaming experiences.
Cool, thanks, John. That's great. Yeah, no, I'm doing a fellowship with the Association of Professional Futurists and looking at geopolitics in the Arctic Circle. And in the process of doing the research, we decided to do a game. So I was about halfway through the research and we did a game about the Arctic Circle, but a war game. And I was going back to my old school days as a high schooler, thinking oh, this is going to be just some silly game. Why are we doing this? But it turned out that we got a lot of innovative ideas and insights from that experience, things I didn't think about. Different trends that I wasn't really aware of that could happen because you're putting in different people's ideas about the future, but also in this context where it doesn't matter, right? So much. It's just for fun in some sense. And that's kind of nice. I know a friend of mine, he's a neuroscientist, and he says when you're in that state of play, it's a really high performance state, actually. If you can get people there, the brain starts creating novel ideas, putting things together in new ways. It doesn't have that stress and pressure of normal everyday kind of life if you're in the context of gaming and playing. So I think there's a lot of value there.
Yeah, I think that's with Steven, right? And that's like a matrix game. So there's lots of randomness, and I think that's your point around kind of the neuroscience behind it, I think is quite essential. I mean, we feel that energy when we play games, right? And actually one of my sort of indulgent purchases over the course of the last 6 months has been a PlayStation. And I did it in part because I needed that release, right? I needed that kind of space, but it's impacted my work really interestingly because I'm getting involved in narrative games, or it's changing my thinking about kind of how would you stage a gaming experience, right? And the different kinds of competition versus collaboration. And so it's really been interesting. And I think as we go into this time, or as we continue to make our way through this time, it's interesting to think about how do we leverage those different kind of mental spaces, right? How do we introduce, uncertainty and randomness? How do we find ways of, focusing on competition versus collaboration, the kinds of interactions that are inherent to games that allow us to be, like you said, in that different mental space that can be quite powerful. Another quick anecdote, I was working with the Ministry of Defense in the UK a few years ago as part of their development process. And they actually have a really great group that publishes something called the Global Strategic Trends Report. I think it's some of the best, trends and emerging issue reports that's out there. And we were working on a project. They had focused initially on Africa, but really what the conversation turned towards was their entire engagement process. So we helped them develop a game where they could actually engage with the experts in really different kinds of ways. And the game was focused on randomness. So you randomly got like 3 or 5 different elements kind of put together. And why we did that was they found that the experts, of course, were, in their kind of bubbles, as we all are, right? We all have certain biases and certain assumptions. So they were able to get these really amazing responses and outputs they would have never gotten if the game didn't focus on randomness. And so I think by having, the random elements of different cards coming together, using die, those different elements to kind of spur that randomness, you can really enhance how people are thinking. And if you already have a really great group of high-level people on a certain topic or certain subject, it really can open up some interesting avenues. So some of those gaming sessions went to really odd places that we would have never have gotten elsewhere, but that allowed us to have a different kind of questioning. So I think it is that leveraging that mental state and taking some of those interactions and elements and making good use of them. And again, I think different levels of or different communities or different organizations are really seeing the value of that in different ways now.
John, a quick one. Do you subscribe to a game design framework when you start thinking about gamifying and engagement for, be it a government or on an organization? Because I'm always tripped over in terms of, this is the challenge, and I think looking at game as a means or a tool for me to reach faster, wider the organization. But it always seems to be like a bespoke game thinking. So do you have a framework or a design methodology that you subscribe to when you start knotting out the detail in terms of how this game has to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say that I have no formal training in game design. I learned from colleagues and sort of learned by doing. I grew up as a Nintendo kid, of course, and now I'm a PlayStation hack trying to do my best. But I think that I've over the years accrued some of some really cool frameworks that I like. I think the one that probably comes to mind is the Octalysis framework.
Yes.
So that's great because it forces you to look at different aspects. I will say that it's not often that you find, let's say, a client who wants to go through that. So sometimes I keep, my process in the background, or I might stage certain questions. Now, actually, what I found is really a good way to approach it from a designing, an engagement process is to put different games in front of people. And then, what do you like? What works for you? Or to try to get people to speak about, if they have gaming experiences. And interestingly, a lot of people, maybe they're not willing to talk about it, right, in a professional format, but they've got, Candy Crush on their phone, or they have a secret, game time that they do. And what is it about that kind of draws you in? So I can certainly share some of those elements, but Octalysis I think is great. I think overall I try to also blend in, kind of like taking a design based approach. So like we're trying to design the game as an actual thing, right? So we want to of course find out as much as we can about our users and like how do we understand what exactly are the needs, the wants, like try to get into that kind of a space, but also continuously bring in the futures component as well. So again, it's sort of a mix of that. And again, I'm happy to share some links to some of the games and some of their stuff. And I've written a little bit about some of the games and how the development process has worked and try to bring that together. So I'm happy to share some of that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also with you on the Octalysis framework. I met them in Thailand during the Corporate Innovation Summit. They're really smart. Fantastic framework. Yeah, and I think just an anecdote, I even draw inspiration from kids' game when I start thinking about the things that we could do, because it's just, we're just big kids anyway. So let's see what the kids are playing and what they're really loving. And yeah, that's also, so those are like mishmash of many inspiration when you start designing, and just a good validation hearing from you, like, yeah, there is no set rules and you just go by the seat of your pants when you design those kind of engagement. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I used to travel around with different card decks and different die and different
Yep.
pieces, and would just kind of walk in with a bit of like a goodie bag. I mean, again, it varies now, and now being online, of course, you can stage things through Miro and Murally or Tabletopia or
Yep.
Roll20, and so there really is lots of really amazing spaces. I'm actually playing a game now for the first time with a colleague on I think Tabletopia we're playing. So like, yeah, it's an interesting time to be able to do that stuff. And again, like I also think as a practitioner, you have to find your own way, right? There's a bit of wayfinding with it, you know, something that works for you and how you want to bring your own mark to it.
Yeah, agree. Thanks.
John, could you say something briefly? I mean, kind of in the same line as this questioning here is, if a leader or an organization wants to get started in gaming, what's some simple things they could do aside from, you know, hiring you or someone else to come in? What's something simple steps they could start to take?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that I've seen where gaming has been successful, there's a key variable there that is really critical, and that's time. So I think, you know, leaders, you know, at the highest level of organizations have to give people the time, and with time comes the, you know, the safe space of and the resources to play. And again, there's of course, you know, serious play, but even, you know, big organizations like, you know, Google and others allow, you know, their employees to have a certain percentage of their time for kind of pet projects, and some of that has morphed into, you know, amazing innovations for those organizations. So I think as a leader, you know, it's obvious you want people to produce, and of course, you know, there's still in some organizations and certainly across, you know, some of the governments and bureaucratic organizations I have a chance to work with, there's that command and control mentality, right? You know, we need to be able to do this and do that and be very siloed, and we have our KPIs and show our results. You know, when you think about the KPIs for play, they're very different than, you know, from something else. You know, I mean, you know, are you having fun? You know, is there learning? And of course, you know, that learning can occur in different ways, not just through play. But I think the opportunity for people to enjoy that experience, again, I think it is shown to really be effective. So I think at the highest level of an organization, you know, in a real leadership, you know, trait, and I think skill, and I think something that organizations have to invest in, is really giving people time. And again, resource wise, now we know that, you know, lots of people have, again, ability, capacity to connect online. Of course, not everybody, but to have the chance to be able to have that space and have that time, and really have the comfort to be able to do it. Again, you know, when I think about the European Commission example, the head of the policy lab, initially in our first meetings, and again, the scenario exploration system was the first project of that policy lab. He said, "Look, this is a risk for us. I mean, if this goes sideways, you know, the organization, you know, looks pretty stupid. And in a place like the European Commission, looking stupid means funding goes away." So what he did was he actually dedicated the lead for that project to continue with it. Of course, he had some other things to do, but like, you know, part of his time was designated for that actual engagement, and that's what allowed it to live on. That's what allowed the community to grow. And of course, you know, that person taking it on and championing it allowed it to be something that I think really, you know, it bore fruit that we would have never have expected at the front end. So I think it's that gift of time. I think it's seeing the opportunity, and I think leaders that can spot that opportunity and give people the time to grow with it, and not just be tied into the immediacy of an investment or return on your investment, but to allow it to kind of mutate and evolve and give it space. I think there's a lot of efficacy and a lot of benefit there.
Anyone else have any questions for John?
A quick one. So I guess when you a quick one. So when it comes to play, it also has to do with trust and rapport building with the organization. I mean, obviously, organizations would not be very willing to provide KPI information and certain details, or perhaps even the symptoms or the problems that they are going through in means of getting a solution. So as far as getting a solution from, let's say, conservative companies or to bureaucratic organizations who, I mean, you will definitely get a lot of people who would have a handgun just to kill your idea, the idea of foresight. So how do we kind of deal with those challenges? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing question, right? I mean, certainly, and I was just talking about this with a colleague in Nigeria just yesterday. How do you get organizations to see the value when organizations are, like pinching every penny, when, now more than ever, they feel like they can only invest in things that are going to give them that return on investment, right? When you're telling them, look, this is something that isn't going to bear fruit immediately, but is going to allow you to make better decisions. And sometimes, that doesn't play with organizations. So I think it is about, being upfront and honest about, what is it that foresight or a futures approach can do for an organization. I think there's so many case studies and examples now of it enhancing how organizations can learn. A really interesting study that was done quite recently, and that was actually a 7-year study. So it's a longitudinal study done by some colleagues in Europe that track foresight in companies. And what they found is that over a 7-year period, the companies that had invested in foresight, the companies that actually made this part of their institutional kind of systemic processes for policy planning strategy, not only did they have greater market share, they were actually more profitable. So I think there is, and again, a lot of times there's the struggle for this, what's the bottom line impact? That was an amazing landmark study because it showed that actually within a corporate context, there really is a bottom line impact. So, we talk about anticipation, or we talk about, being more forward looking. Fundamentally, this has been shown to benefit certainly corporate organizations. And I think when we look at, across governments, the governments that have invested in foresight, tried to make it, of course, part of their DNA. I think you find, that people do, are happier. You find greater social, equality. I think people feel like they're more connected. But to your point, it's sometimes difficult for an organization to want to share. So I was actually I worked actually with the government of Singapore, the Center for Strategic Futures, a number of years ago, and we did a project that was focused on civil service. It was a game focused on trust. So they had done a bunch of research. Again, the government did a bunch of research. And again, I didn't have a security clearance or anything. They gave us all this research on how the government was seeing trust in relation to the public. And it was amazing because obviously there was all these, kind of questions and perspectives about the government and what's the government doing. And so it was their kind of analysis of the online space. And what we ended up doing was we designed the entire game to make it such that, the point wasn't to win, but the point was to experience how the public might see government. So again, that's a really different mode of learning. And again, they're using this within the context of civil service training. So they actually have a civil service college who now has the game, and I think the game is still living on and part of the Center for Strategic Futures. But it was a really delicate situation because no government wants to give up all their secrets or publish that or whatever. But again, the game as a process allowed those conversations to take place. And so you would role play as different ministries, you had to collaborate, but somebody got to act as the public and give the voice to the public. And that was really fascinating. So that was an interesting gaming experience where, like you're saying, it was delicate. You want to have that learning, you want to have that impact, but you also want to have it be some place where it can be a little bit safe. Yeah. And so again, it really varies, but I think that was another example where it did have a real impact. People felt a different sense of being a civil servant, I think, by participating in that, just like we see the impact on corporate organizations from investing in foresight.
So I guess tabletop exercise is something that organizations are a lot more will accept it a lot more easier than any other than the other items you are mentioning, perhaps. I mean, even though they're higher end and are more cognitive, and yet perhaps tabletop exercise would be the best entry level.
Yeah, I will say, yeah, that I've had a lot of success with, I think, the tabletop exercise, and actually people asking for tabletop exercises. Of course, now everything is mutated and morphed into online spaces, right? So, I mean, we're running lots of online gaming sessions. I'm part of a community called the Global Swarm. Actually, Donna DuPont, hi Donna, who's with us, is also part of that group, and we did a report focused on participatory futures. And then we developed a game based on that report. And for the last, let's say, well, now actually 10 months, we've been running gaming sessions. So we have actually one coming up this weekend focused on space. I can share that as well. But we actually built this interesting community around this kind of game and around this approach. So some of it translates well. Some of it, of course, is really meant for that kind of sitting at a table. But I think now, as we're seeing, we were, and if there's any one lesson I think out of our current moment, we're really underutilizing a lot of the amazing technologies that we had. I mean, of course, I love the experience of travel, love the experience of being in the room and feeling that energy. But there's been some really amazing opportunities for engagement and learning through games and using online spaces. I mean, of course, I look forward to being back in the room when it's possible. But I think actually to find that space and to do it online has really been also interesting. And of course, now organizations they all want that because they realize we have to take advantage of this. We can't just put everything on pause. And now is a really interesting opportunity to kind of leverage and see what can be done online as well.
Yeah, well, count me in. I'll send my email. Thanks.
Great.
I'd love to take on that.
Any final questions there? We'll wrap up here. Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us and John for sharing his wisdom and insights around play and foresight. We'll be doing our final fireside chat in 2 weeks. So hopefully we'll see you there as well. We're going to be having another one of Haku Global Advisors, Gabriel Fernandez Bueno, talking about just a little bit about physiology, mitochondria actually, and high performance from the perspective of leadership and leadership physiology, and providing people with some unique tools that they can start to use. And so hopefully you'll join us there. And until next time, have an amazing day. Thanks, John.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.